Everyone knows what maps are. Traditionally, maps are used to convey information. So we've got two examples up here. The one on the upper left is a map of a burial mound in Racine County. This is a small-scale map, and you're basically showing the relationship of the mound to the road. Now, if I'm in your way, just tell me and I can get it so I can move. The second map is Louisiana Parte Centrale. I don't know if I said that right or not. But it was a map that was commissioned by the French government, and they hired an Italian cartographer to do it. And he completed it in 1695, and we actually have this in our archives at the Historical Society. And that's the upper Midwest right there. You can see Lake Superior, Lake Michigan. The Mississippi River is the big squiggly line down on the left side, and Wisconsin is the one that's sort of pointing towards Lake Michigan. It looks very different than what you would expect to see a map to look like today, but in 1695, that was the technology, and that was an amazing map for the time. So today, we're using maps to make decisions. So we're not just trying to show relationships in space. We want to use them for more of an analysis tool. And to do that, we're using something called Geographic Information Systems. And that is just a fancy way of saying drawing maps on a computer. What the nice part about this is that you're able to combine tabular data and the processing power of a computer along with the graphics graphics that you can put on a PC. And that combination can let you do all sorts of interesting things with that. You can attach data to points, and then within those points, you can start to tease out additional information to start looking for trends. And these can be applied for all sorts of different uses. This isn't a new idea. People have been doing this for a long time. And so the first example on the left is the plague map from Bari, Italy in 1694. So unfortunately for the residents of Bari, there was an outbreak of bubonic plague that year. And so the Papal States decided to quarantine the area. The wall in the upper right is the initial quarantine area where if you were in that part of it, basically those little towns on the coast, you weren't getting outside of that wall. And that was all to contain the outbreak. The second line, the little triangle-shaped things on the outside, that was a secondary emplacement to try and contain the outbreak, and just in case people did get loose. So this was intended as a military map, just to show troop deployment. But if you showed this to an epidemiologist, this would give them a lot of information. And this is getting to the analysis part. If they know the initial outbreak of the plague, you can see the initial barrier. So that would be your spread across space and time over the disease vectors and that spread of time. The secondary wall is also the spread of the disease for that space and time. Back then, they might not have been able to use it so much. Today, that would be something that would be very, very helpful, especially with the Ebola outbreak that's going on right now in Africa, things like that. This kind of information could be very helpful. And then, again, continuing in the medical applications, the map on the right is Dr. John Snow's cholera map from London in 1854. So in 1854, there was an outbreak of cholera, and this doctor was trying to figure out, all right, we've got to figure out how to stop this. What he did was he took a paper map and he started drawing little hash marks for each person that had an outbreak. And you can see like the stacks get pretty high where that water pump is. And so his theory was that, okay, there's something contaminating the water in that pump. They closed down the pump, replaced everything, cleaned it out, put everything back, and the cholera epidemic burned out. This was an example of using maps to do analysis. This doctor was able to just by drawing lines, sketching lines on a map, he was able to figure this out, find the right course of action. It was a guess, but it was an educated guess, and it paid off by burning out the outbreak a lot faster than other means could have. And that's kind of what we get into when we start talking about GIS, except the technology is just a little bit different. So instead of using pen and paper, now we're using PCs and fancy monitors. Then if you have questions at any point, please just raise your hand or just holler at me and I'll talk to you. So there are multiple uses in a number of different fields. I want to touch on 4 of them today that I have personal experience with. I'm going to talk about archaeology, police and fire analysis, environmental engineering, and forestry. So when I was working for the city of Fitchburg, the city was small enough that I became known as the mapping guy. So when different departments had questions or needed help with something, they would come to me. First was something pretty simple, like the fire department needed a map of a neighborhood because they were going to run an exercise. Okay, that's no problem. Pretty soon it became, hey, there was an accident here, we need something a little bit more quicker. By the end, I was doing stuff for the police department, the fire department, economic development, planning, that's all sorts of different applications. And eventually got into forestry, and then in my neck of the woods where I was in engineering, I was doing all sorts of stuff with that too. So the first thing we're going to talk about is archaeology. That picture on the left, it's really, really hard to see. But if you look, you can see a real subtle variation in the vegetation. That's kind of like a little bit of fun. The area is a little bit higher. That's a burial mound. That's a bear mound in the city of Madison, just on the other side of the river. For most people, trying to look at that picture and pick out a bear mound is really, really difficult because it just looks like a field with some weeds on it. But if you look on the picture on the right, this is a LiDAR image of that park, and you can see those two mounds just really pop out. Those are two effigy mounds. They were built about roughly 1,500 to 2,000 years ago. They're still around. They managed to survive the neighborhood development, and they're very special features that are part of Wisconsin. Wisconsin in particular has the most burial mounds of any place in the United States, and Madison, with the 4 lakes around here, they'd have an incredible density of mounds, even for Wisconsin. Unfortunately, roughly 80 to 90% of the mounds have been destroyed just through either cultivation, development, things like that. So the ones that are still around, they're a valuable resource, and we try to protect them. So this mound is actually, it's Elmside Park, and if you're ever interested, it's 2919 Lakeland Avenue in Madison, just on the other side of the lake. And then to give you a more local example, that is a little pocket park in Monona, and the address is 6208 Ridgewood, and that is a conical mound. The city bought that parcel and dedicated it as public space. There used to be a much bigger mound group in the area, but most of those are gone with the houses going up and things like that. But that little bump right there, that's a survivor, and that is an example of just something that's in your neighborhood that was around 2,000 years ago. Yeah.
Could you clarify again what LiDAR technology is?
Sure. So we were able to get these images by using a technology called LiDAR, which stands for Light Ranging and Detection. What that involves is you're basically putting a laser on a plane. The plane flies overhead, and it'll shoot a pulse every couple seconds. The more pulses you shoot, the greater accuracy you're going to have on the map. And what this does is it lets you, it gives you a surface model of the ground. So if it hits a tree, it'll bounce back, it'll hit a tree. The laser sometimes will be able to pass through leaves until it actually hits the ground and doesn't pass through anything else. You get 2 kinds of returns with that. You get your first return, which is your tree canopy, houses, stuff like that, and your bare earth model, which is what we're looking at with those images. That bare earth model will just show you what is on the ground, and that can be used for floodplain delineation, road construction, just seeing how the lay of the land, survey. It's not as good as getting out in the field with a total station or things like that to do survey. You can do rough estimates with survey using LiDAR. So this is another example. This is a mound group in Crawford County. And this was a group that I was out, I did a project in Crawford County where we were basically out mapping mounds, but we were doing this all, drawing everything in by hand. So this mound group, it had 10 conicals. The original site report said 10 conicals, 1 bird effigy, and 1 linear mound. So we went out there and we found their 10 conicals are bird and are linear. And if you look at, and that's the map that I drew of the mound group. And if you look on the right, you can see that same mound group with a LiDAR, but there's one big difference. There's a second bird out there. And it's kind of embarrassing to admit that I missed that, but I'd missed that. And the reason why we missed it was because Crawford County is wonderful for growing buckthorn. There was lots and lots of buckthorn out there, and when we found what the site report said was going to be out there, we stopped looking for anything else. We should have kept looking, so we missed that one. But if you look at that map that was made in 2000, 2001, and then the LiDAR image that was from 2010 or somewhere around there, when you compare the two, you can see something that we missed. And by being able to go back, compare the new image with the original site map, you can see the big difference. How we missed something. This landowner. If you catalog mound groups, you get a little bit of a tax break for that. So by finding that mound group, we saved them a little bit extra money. So it works out. So with LiDAR technology, you can also find non-prehistoric stuff. And the next example I give you is badger huts. This was in southwest Wisconsin near Potosi. We got a site report of the remains of 2 badger huts, which were shelters for lead miners back in the late 1840s, 1850s, somewhere around there. Someone went out there in 1992 and they noticed pits that were near the huts, which were the remains of where they were actually digging. There were spoil piles, holes in the ground, and that was considered a significant find, so it was added to the site record. When we look at it in LiDAR, so the badger huts are the kind of orangish blob on the left, and at the very top of that blob, you can see those little depressions in there. Those were the original pits that they noticed. But if you look off to the right, you can see a whole lot more of them over there. How those were missed was because, again, we're in the driftless area. So those flat areas, those areas that are nice and smooth, that's level ground where that's good for farming. So you could crop that, you could run cattle on it, whatever you wanted to do. Where it starts getting bumpy and where all those lead pits are, either the slope was too steep to try and grow anything, or if you tried to raise cattle on there, the cows would lose more weight walking up and down the hills than they would gain from eating the grass. So all that area was just left to grow back. It got revegetated. No one was doing anything with it, and all those holes stayed. So those are all old lead mining pits from about 120, 130 years ago.
How deep are they?
They're not super deep, like maybe 10, 15 feet, but
What are all the green dots?
those green dots, those are buildings that are considered architecturally significant. So Potosi was an older town, so there's a lot of unique architecture. And then with the combination of the archaeology, the historic buildings, this would be an area that could potentially be considered for nomination for the National Register of Historic Places. And I'm going to give you one more example. So we're going to talk about the Metz Mound Group, and I'm going to go a little bit on how the Historical Society records sites, our whole process from when it gets first reported to field verification to updates. The State Historical Society has an archaeological database, and it's a living document. It's always growing. It's always getting bigger. People are always finding stuff. And this is kind of an example of how things change over 40, 45 years. So in 1972, there was a student at Beloit, and his name was Rick Yerkes. And he had a friend who lived in Crawford County, and his friend mentioned, hey, I've got some burial mounds on my parents' farm. So they went out there, they checked it out, and Dr. Yerkes was an anthropology student, or Rick Yerkes was an anthropology student. So he wrote a letter to the Historical Society, gave them a description of what it was, where it was located, and so the Historical Society recorded it. No one went out there and field checked it because they didn't have the staff to do it. In 1979, someone actually went out there to go take a look at it. They went out there, they found it with the location. So what they were able to do is they were able to tighten up the location description so they got it a little bit more accurate so people could find it a little bit easier. But the person who went out there to check it in 1979 didn't agree with the original interpretation. They saw the bear, they agreed with that, but he didn't see a bird mound. He thought it was just a linear. And again, we're talking about Crawford County, so the buckthorn's coming in again. So it does make things hard to see. In 2000, I happened to be out there, And so we went back out there, and using a pocket transit and a tape, we found the bear and we found the bird again. Those little circles down on the bottom, those were guy wires for a utility pole. And so we tied in the bear to the location of the guy wires, and we were able to map everything in, and there's a nice site record. And so it's a cool map, but it doesn't provide a lot of context. It just says, here's a couple of mounds, here's something that was nearby.
Could you
Mhm.
clarify what pocket transit and tape involve?
Sure, so pocket transit is just, it's basically a high-tech compass, but it's a little bit, it's not something that you would buy, like Gander Mountain or something like that. You put it on a tripod. It gives you pretty accurate reading. And then from there, we make a datum, which is basically just sticking a stake in the ground. We run a tape through it. We get a distance and a bearing, and we'll jot those down. When we get back in the office, we put those points down on the map, again, using our distance and our bearing off our datum. And then we're just basically connecting the dots to make the map. So in 2012, after the last round of floods, FEMA was providing money for states, in particular Wisconsin, to do LiDAR flights for flood planning purposes. The secondary benefit of that was because it was FEMA money, it was all public data. We were able to take that, we were able to start using that to do our job, which is to look for, do analysis looking for archaeological sites. So when you look at the LiDAR image, you can see the bird and the bear. They're still there. The bear's a little bit hard to see, but the bird really stands out. What the LiDAR image was able to verify was that now we have two pieces of evidence, the field visit in 2000 and now the LiDAR image, that really is a bear and it's not a linear mound.
How large is the bird from the tip?
I don't remember off the top of my head. I want to say it was a good 30 to 40 feet. I mean, they're big. And then finally, you can drape an aerial image on top, and then you can get a really dramatic picture of of the context of the site. So that clearing right there, that's a clearing for the utility lines. Those little white dashes that are every so often up on top, those are the crossbars for that utility line. This is just an aerial photo. And then I draped the aerial photo on top of the LiDAR image and kind of played with the contrast a little bit. So you can see those mounds popping out in the context. How they were able to survive for the last 2,000 years was that they're basically buried in the woods. And they got a little bit lucky that when they ran that clearing through, they did not go through the mounds. And it's a really cool picture too, just because it gives you an idea of, it's a beautiful site because you're looking, if you just look a little bit to the south, you're overlooking the Mississippi River. It's just really pretty. That clearing there with the mounds, it's a really, really nice site. So to get into a couple other applications, for police and fire analysis, we can use GIS to provide insights for trends, social areas that may need social services, things like that, and resource allocation. Traditionally, the common practice is you get a paper map, you hang it on the wall, you start putting pins in there to try and figure out, to start looking for patterns. With using GIS, you can do the pins on the computer, and then you can attach more than one data point to each pin. So in this case, this was a neighborhood, an apartment complex that was having some problems. I took out all the nuisance calls, and all the major incidents are left on that map. If we had just left the nuisance calls on there, there'd be a whole bunch of dots all over the place. But if you pick out the piddly stuff like litter, graffiti, things like that, and you look at the bigger incidents, you can see that there's little clusters up in the northwest corner and in the southwest. You can see the clusters were areas that needed help. From this map, we were able to work with the rental company, with the owners. They let the police department put in a pocket police station right where Traceway and Post Road meet. They basically gave them an apartment, said you can have an office here. There was there was a small, basically an office for the police department. Building inspection was allowed in there so that they could start taking care of quality of life issues. And with those two things, having police on site where they were, instead of being in the patrol cars providing like the intimidating presence, they would be able to go out, walk around, talk to people, try to get show their presence, but in a more people to people way. Instead of being someone sitting behind the car, they would go out, talk to people, try and improve things a little bit. With the building inspection and the social services that were offered there, it was able to provide more resources for the tenants to better able to kind of settle things down. And then this actually really helped because in a couple of years, things settled down quite a bit and the neighborhood was no longer, it wasn't nearly as bad as the situation was earlier before we started taking a little bit closer look at this. When you look at crime statistics across the city, you can see patterns that start to emerge, and then enforcement and social services can be focused to the area in need. So this map right here, the map on the left, each call to 911 or to the police department has an address tag to it. We're able to take those addresses and run them through the software to put a little point for each call. Those bigger dots that you can see scattered around up there, those are multiple calls to one location. So for a place like the Target on the far west side, you have things like fender benders in the parking lot, people getting caught shoplifting, things like that. Lots of calls. Store policy dictates that they have to call the police when certain things happen. Those areas have lots of calls. If you go to other areas, you can start to see, there's intersections where there's a lot of traffic accidents. That's something that we can look at. Maybe we need to do something with the traffic patterns in this area, tweak the light timing of the lights, things like that. The maps on the right are hotspot mapping, where you create a grid, you figure out how many maps or how many calls are in, you get in 1 year, and you start kind of piecing out what would be average, what would be a normal amount for the entire city, how many calls are in one section of this grid. Calls that have a higher than standard deviation get marked in red. Calls that have lower calls than expected to be in blue. You can start to see patterns emerge where we got 2012, 2013, 2014. Again, the northern edge of the city, lots of calls. The southwest edge, not so many. When you combine it across 3 years, you can start to see that middle area, the middle area of the city, not a whole lot going on there. Maybe you don't need to run the patrol cars quite so often. The northern and the western edge of the city, that's maybe when you are at start, maybe think about increasing police presence, maybe trying to think about how social services can go in there to try and help things, working with landlords, working with tenants, trying to improve the situation. So hopefully in the future, there simply aren't as many incidents and the police can, not have to go running around all the time. We can use GIS for pre-planning of events. Unfortunately, there's been a spate of school shootings lately, and the police department they're ready for it. So the map on the bottom right is just an aerial photograph of an elementary school and a middle school that are right next to each other. This map can provide a lot of information to a first responder. If there was an incident at the school, you can see that there's the main entrance off of the roads up there, but there's also a bike path that kind of runs along the back end and into the neighborhood. If you ever needed to, say, go in from a different angle, if you needed to get lots of resources in as quickly as possible, you could look at driving up the street, going and coming down the bike path to get in there. It's a little backdoor route. If there was ever an incident where potentially someone did something and then took off, that's a cornfield off to the left. There's not a whole lot in there. Being able to look at an air photograph and see, hey, there's this big empty space. If it's in the middle of summer or if it's in early fall, and someone runs in there, they're going to be really hard to find. You would be able to set up a perimeter, and that can again help with planning. If hopefully it would never happen, but if you need to try to land the helicopter to try to evacuate victims, again, you have a clearing, you know where you can go. GPS coordinates are already plugged in, so if needed, you could just send, this is where we need you to go. That gets plugged into MedFlight. They can come right in without having to think about trying to locate intersections or things like that. Emergency management. This was a situation, it happened over Memorial Day weekend, where a person was, they were on antidepressants, they drank a bottle of vodka, then they got their gun out and started walking around that apartment building. Obviously, it's not a good situation. It's a holiday weekend, so there's not a lot of people around. I got brought in at 1 in the morning, and the situation is that that's a big drop-off down there. It's a steep hill, and it's a difficult area to try and get bearings on. So what I needed to do was to make a contour map. So they're kind of hard to see, but you can see those faint lines on the image. Those are 4-foot contours, so that gives people an idea of the slope of the hill. And in this case, they positioned snipers at the top of the hill, and in the garage and the building across from 5550. This ended well because eventually the vodka kicked in and he fell asleep, and that was the end of it. But again, in a situation where you have, a couple hundred, probably a couple hundred residents in a confined space, someone with a gun and in a bad mood, that could get very ugly very quickly. Being able to have information like this is a very big asset. A second example is there was a gas spill at a grocery distribution warehouse. So those pink lines right there on the map in the parking lot, that is storm sewer. And what happened was a truck was backing up and it got hit by, I think it hit its fuel tank on part of the loading dock, and so diesel started spilling out. The police officer was the first one on the scene, and the first thing he noticed was that there was no gas anywhere. So where's it going? I was actually out of the office because my son had just been born, so I wasn't there to actually pull up anything for them, but I had built an application for other people to use. What they were able to do is, a couple clicks, they were able to pull up the air photo. The little squares on there, those are catch basins. So from that, they were able to figure out that, okay, the spill is right there, there's nothing pulling, it's going into the catch basin. And then you just basically follow the arrows, it's going down there, it's going up, and it's going to discharge right about where the bike trail is, where you see that big brown line with all the trees. Being able to figure that out within 5 minutes, they were able to block the flow of the diesel before it made it all the way out to the discharge point, and then they were able to vacuum it out from there. So instead of having a major spill that would go into a greenway that would eventually make its way into our lakes, they were able to contain it, keep it on site, which saved the trucking company a whole lot of money because that would have been very, very expensive to clean up. As it was, it still costs money to get everything out of there, but it's a lot cheaper to clean a couple hundred feet of pipe instead of trying to clean out a few miles of creek. And then the last example I'll give for this is trial materials. There was a murder case in Fitchburg where the defendant's alibi was that they were working at a place up in Middleton, and the defense attorney said that there wasn't enough time for him to get from the time he clocked out to where the incident happened in that time. So what we were able to do is, using GIS data, they have an application where you can do time and space. It's basically, like he did the old story problems in math. Train A leaves the station at 20 miles an hour, train B. It's basically the same idea. Rate times time equals distance. Using network analysts, we were able to calculate how long it would take for him to drive from the red cross at the very top of the map down to the cross at the bottom of the map. And under normal driving conditions, it would have taken 20 minutes to get there, and his alibi said by the time he clocked out and by the time the incident was reported, and it was reported immediately, it was 45 minutes. Going back, looking at DOT traffic cameras for that day, and looking at the film that they had on the Beltline, there were no traffic accidents or no incidents. It was a smooth flow day. So with those two little pieces of evidence, we were able to basically disprove his alibi. When presented with that, the defendant then pled guilty. It was an ugly case. I'm not going to go into the details, but it was a good thing that they didn't try to drag out the trial. It ended it, and justice was able to be served for the victim. Getting to something a little more cheerful, environmental engineering. So for stormwater management, this is a lot of what I was doing when I was with Fitchburg. Engineers like to keep plans, and they like to keep drawings, and they like to have all sorts of fun stuff that they can go back and look at. In this case, that filing cabinet right there in the middle, that's about probably 5 feet tall. Those are all Mylar drawings of sewer, water, storm sewer, all sorts of good stuff. Basically, all the stuff that you take for granted, like when you flush the toilet, it goes away. When you turn on the tap, water shows up. We've got to maintain all that. And using those Mylars and distribution maps is how we keep track of things. Unfortunately, as cities get bigger, as things get more complicated, it gets hard to go back to run to the shop and try to dig out the right drawing, and then run back out to where there could be a problem and try to figure things out. What GIS lets us do is take all that paper and put it onto an iPad, and then we can take that out in the field to go find things like that stormwater outfall. We can link our maps to those Mylar drawings, so that gives us basically 2 reference points. If there's a spill, or if there's an accident, or if there's something that's broken, we're able to pull up the GIS data and say, okay, the map says that this water valve is here. If I need to cut off the water supply down the street where the break is, I need to crank this valve. Then you can double check that by hitting a link, pulling up the Mylar drawing of that, and that can confirm that, yep, this is the right thing. We need to shut this one off to continue our work to try and get things going like we want to. The secondary use of this is that we can use GIS data to pull together information on impervious area, green space, stormwater facilities, and we can use that to build models to model water quality. The state has passed a law where cities have to meet a 40%, it's called TSS, total suspended solid reduction. Basically, we have to reduce the amount of gunk that gets into the public waters. So to do that, we use stormwater basins, rain gardens, stormwater facilities to try and trap pollutants upstream before they get downstream into the bigger water bodies. To determine the best way to do this, we'll use models. This particular model is called SLAM. Inside of SLAM, we need to plug in the acres of rooftop, the acres of road, acres of impervious area, acres of grass. You can plug in the actual stormwater facilities, the depth of the pond, how big it is, and then the model will run annual rainfall for an example year, and that will tell you it's a model, so it's not perfect, but it will give you a pretty good idea. If you had nothing in there, this is how much gunk would be getting out into the lakes. If you put in a stormwater pond, this is how much you'll be saving, how much you can prevent from getting into the lakes. Fitchburg was a little bit older city, so we had to do a lot of retrofits to try and meet those stormwater quality requirements. By using the model and using GIS, we're able to basically figure out our biggest bang for the buck. We can design and propose a pond to go in a neighborhood. We'll run the model, say we'll get like 30% TSS reduction. We'll look at option B, where we put it in a different area where maybe it picks up more volume, and that gets us 40%. Well, we're going to put the pond at 40, where we can get 40% reduction. It lets us spend our money a little bit more intelligently, and it helps us meet the stormwater requirements a little bit quicker. Yes?
On the last one, you mentioned something about Mylar drawing.
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
It's basically, it's fancy paper. It's kind of, it's sort of see-through. It's a little
I
bit,
have some.
oh yeah.
I'm just wondering, how can you make a drawing out of it?
Oh, they just use, these a higher quality printer. It's basically, you run it through a big plotter. Engineering firms have the stuff to do all this, but you take a CAD drawing, you spin it up, and then you run it through the plotter, and you use a little bit higher quality ink, a little bit higher heat, and that'll just make everything stick to the Mylar. And then it also, the nice thing with that is it also lasts a lot longer than a paper map. So, I mean, we've got Mylar drawings from the 60s. They've yellowed a bit, but they're still, they're still very legible. And the idea is that you keep them out of daylight or sunlight, but in theory, they could last another 20, 30 years. At this point, we've used technology, we've scanned them all, so we have a backup copy now. But those Mylars, for 20, 30 years, those were all of our records. If those ever got lost, we were in big trouble. And so it was pretty funny. When I proposed getting those scanned, my boss was like, all right, I'm willing to try this, but if those drawings get damaged or lost, I'm going to kill you. And so, but everything survived, and I'm still here. So, but yeah. Going out in the field, doing field inspection also lets us look for, find trouble spots. So that little guy in the middle, he's a beaver. And you can see what he was doing with that tree on the left. And what he was doing was, we were having a problem in a neighborhood. There was a Dunn's Marsh, which is a small pond. The water level kept getting higher, it wasn't draining. And we couldn't figure out what the problem was. And so we were checking, nothing was backed up. We were trying to figure out what's going on. And finally, the last place we checked, we noticed all this stuff piled up on top of that outfall. And then looking a little bit closer, we saw the tree and the teeth marks on there, and like, oh. And so we started clearing things off, and eventually we noticed that guy in the middle. I'm not sure how a beaver wound up in the middle of a city, but he made his way there, and he was building himself a nice, comfortable little home there. We ended up trapping him and moving him off somewhere else so he could get out of there. We had to clear out the outfall, and after that, the water level dropped right back down. But again, it's things like this where you start noticing problems. You're able to go out in the field with that iPad, start checking those, basically checking, troubleshooting, trying to find the problem area, and then when you figure it out, then you can do a solution. So the last example I'm going to give you is for forestry. I don't have a forestry background, but we had a city forester, and sometimes it's a long story, but sometimes in order to get people to do the right thing, you have to give some sort of incentive to do it. And in this case, there was an application called iTree, and what iTree does is that it basically monetizes the value of the urban forest. So if you have, 50% tree canopy across the city, that will reduce cooling costs in the summer by, I'm just throwing numbers out here, they're probably not accurate, but by like 15%. Just the shade that is provided by a tree will keep houses cool. You don't have to crank the air conditioning. It saves energy. Trees and grass will soak up water. When we get, like this month, obviously, we've got lots and lots of rain. That trees in that green space, they will soak up water where it's not going, where if rain hits concrete, it doesn't have anywhere to go, it just runs off until it finds a place to dump off into in the lake. If it hits the ground, if it hits trees, the grass will absorb it, trees can soak it up. Trees and green space provide a big economic impact in that it reduces costs of stormwater infrastructure. It's a lot cheaper to have a field and some trees than to put in pipe, stormwater pond, things like that. So in this case, what we did was we used infrared aerial imagery and LiDAR to pick out trees from grass, from pavement, from water at a citywide level. Before with land cover models, and the DNR puts these together for the whole state, but they use satellites in orbit to do that. And the resolution is it's about 30-meter resolution. So those 30-meter pixels are too big to give you a whole lot of detail for a smaller area like a city. So when we use an aerial photography, which will give us, roughly 6-inch resolution, that's a lot better detail for what we want. By being able to take, the first step was to do the impervious extraction. So we'd take an infrared image, we'd run it through some training software, and using the infrared signature, we were able to extract trees from grass, from water, from concrete or asphalt. Each of those different things has a different IR signature. You tell the computer what to look for, and it'll pull those 4 categories out. Then from there, we'll take the bare earth surface model. That basically gives us our ground surface, so we know where the water is going to go. And then we're using the thing that I mentioned earlier, the first return model, which is giving us heights. So that's tree cover, houses, things like that. And then we kind of basically stack the 2 on top of each other to make this model. What we were looking for is areas where the infrared and the LiDAR agreed. So if infrared said, yep, that's a tree, and the LiDAR said, yep, that's a tree, that's a tree. If we got to areas where they disagreed, then we're going to we're more likely to lean towards the LiDAR in this case. Just because that we can pick up tree canopy, and it's a lot more accurate than what the training model was for the infrared imagery. So from that, we're able to make a land cover model for the city. Those dark green areas, that's all tree cover. The lighter green, that's all grass. The brownish splotches on there are impervious areas, so rooftops, streets, sidewalk, things like that, stuff that water can't get through. And then the blue areas are water. And then from this, you can see you can learn a lot about the characteristics of a city. So that green splotch up on the very top, that's the Curtis Prairie in the UW Arboretum. It's all prairie grass. It's very nice. It's nice and green, big open space. If you go a little bit to the right, that's a neighborhood that's probably 40, 50 years old. Lots of trees, lots of developed tree cover. That's an area where you've got, a mature tree canopy. If you go to the south, those areas where you can kind of see the houses and you can see like the clearly defined streets and stuff like that, that's a new subdivision. That went in about 2000. So you've got an immature tree cover, smaller trees, smaller skinny toothpick trees and that area is growing in. With the data that we were able to get from this, we were able to plug that into that program, iTree, and we were able to determine the economic value of the forest. The city forester was able to take that information, present it to the city council. This is why we need a forestry program. This is why it's a good thing to keep us funded. And from there, we're able to allocate resources so they continue the forestry program, to try to expand what they're doing a little bit. The other thing with this is that when the Emerald Dashboard came through, we were able to do estimates of timber mass, try to figure out if we need to start taking down trees, where are they coming from, how much wood volume are we going to have to deal with, and how are we going to replace them. The big problem with a lot of tree diseases that come through is that when trees are planted in neighborhoods in the 50s to 70s, everyone went with maples because they're pretty and they look nice in the fall. If you get a bug that wipes out maples, you've just taken out your entire canopy. There wasn't a whole lot of thought for tree diversity when they were doing neighborhoods back then. Now it's common to mix a wide variety of different trees, so if something does come through, you don't lose your entire urban forest with one infestation.
What would be the ratio of impervious to pervious?
In the urbanized area, it was roughly, I want to say 25 to 30% impervious, maybe 25 to 30% grass, 5 or 6% water, and everything else was trees. And then this actually ended up turning into a report, and if you're interested, that little web link has the report for the whole model, and it kind of explains where we went from the data collection to putting out our output for the end. So if you're interested, it's there, or you could just do a Google search for Fitchburg land cover, Wisconsin DNR. And with that, I will be done talking. And if you have questions, please feel free to ask. Yes?
Converting those Mylar documents into GIS, was that very automated, or did people have to do a lot of?
No, that was some work. What we ended up doing was we scanned all those drawings. We hired a contractor based out of Waukesha. They came, they picked them up, and I think they had students who were doing it, but they just basically ran it through all the scanner. We got the electronic drawings back. We got our Mylars back. From there, we linked the images to the GIS. So basically, we attached a picture to, like I mentioned before, how you make points. That picture was just another data point. So if you click on the computer, if you click on a manhole cover, for example, you can pull up that drawing, and so that gives you your second reference point.
Is Monona using these?
Yeah, it is. Actually, a guy I know, his name is Brad. He's the GIS guy in Monona, and they're doing similar stuff. They started a little bit later than Fitchburg did, but they're catching up pretty quickly.
What are they doing with it?
A lot of the similar stuff. The first step is you always want to build your database, and that involves the field collection. Once you get it from there, that's when you can start doing the stormwater modeling and stuff like that. Like I was actually talking to Brad a couple of weeks ago. He was asking me about getting trained for SLAM and what the process is for that. So they're kind of looking at doing the same thing. There are engineering firms out there that you can hire to do all this stuff for you, but if you can learn how to do it in-house, you're saving yourself a lot of money because the engineering firms will charge you a lot to do all this stuff. And then the nice thing is that you don't have to take their cookie cutter process to build your models. You can kind of tweak it for what you want to do. Like in our case, I was able to plug in actual values instead of typical urban parameters. And so we got a much more realistic picture of what we were looking at for our TSS. And that was also a big benefit because it improved our numbers significantly than what you get out of the box.
So what's next for technology in GIS?
Things are changing a little bit in that there's a lot more emphasis on doing more web maps, stuff that's publicly available. All the software that we actually use to do this stuff, it's pretty expensive. There's a lot more focus on getting more interactive maps, more public-facing maps, which is nice. And so there's a lot more online stuff, trying to make stuff that's more user-friendly for the public, for people to look at and get access to. With the city of Fitchburg, one of the things I did before I left was making a bike trail map. And what it was from that was we've got a couple mountain bike trails. We have a big, the Nine Springs, Military Ridge, and there's one more, the new one that just went in, Southwest Commuter. Those are a lot of there's a lot of bike trails. We have our mountain bike trails, and Fitchburg is starting to get known as a place to go biking. Putting all that online and just saying, here are bike trails. If you want to go mountain biking, here's a place where you can park. Here's a trailhead, and then you just lay out the different courses: the easy one, the hard one, the medium one. That's a big benefit for people who want to come out, who want to get some exercise, and it helps the city too. Like as far as when they come in, they're going to be tired afterwards. They're going to go find some place to eat. They're going to want to hit the grocery store before they get there, so they load up on Gatorade and Cliff Bars or whatever. And so it's a little bit of an economic engine too.
I have a
Yes.
question. So you hear a lot about coyotes and different wildlife
Mhm.
changing their normal territorial boundaries and moving more into
Mhm.
more densely populated areas. Is that something that you could use GIS to track?
Yeah, there's actually at UW, someone is running something called the Candid project. I think that's the scientific name for a dog. Basically, he set up a website, and if people in the neighborhood see a coyote or if they see a fox, they can plug in the information where they saw it, and they'll put they're using GIS to put a little pin on a map, and they're trying to figure out basically where coyotes, fox, stuff like that are living now, and trying to figure out the new habitat ranges. And what they're finding is kind of interesting that in an urban environment, coyotes will generally chase off fox. They don't get along too well, at least in more natural areas. In an urbanized setting, there's enough food for both of them that they leave each other alone. So that they're starting to notice that coyote and fox are living closer together and they're not chasing each other off, which means that there's a lot of food for both of them to share, which is going to mean that they're going to continue to settle in until they reach that kind of equilibrium.
I had talked to Felipe ahead of time, and we were discussing the situation in Hawaii and how GIS could be maybe applied to that. And he had some really great comments to make, and maybe
Sure.
summarize them.
So with Hawaii, those are all volcanic islands, and you kind of see the chain of the shape as the tectonics move. Those islands, that's all basically lava that's been spewing out. As the plates have shifted, it moves north. That's that island chain that's going forward. So with the recent volcanoes, that's just, they're making more land essentially. With probably using LiDAR, maybe drones, you'd be able to calculate you could take that base map, like if you had a LiDAR image from a before picture, you could do an after picture, compare the two elevations, see how things have changed. That would let you could probably figure out how much lava has actually come out of the ground in the last month or the last couple of weeks since it started. When things settle down at some point, you could probably, as the lava hits the ocean, eventually that's going to cool. Eventually that's just going to be that's future land or future area of the island. Eventually you'll be able to figure out how much more square footage that you've added to the island. And I mean, there's interesting stuff with that too, in that down in Chile about 5 or 6 years ago, there was a huge earthquake. And one of the things that they noticed was that the one city in particular, Concepcion, shifted about a foot to the east. So you can imagine what that did to all the piping, sewers, stuff like that, to have everything just kind of pretty violently shoved over. And again, not necessarily using GIS for it, but more engineering applications, how you recover from that, how you rebuild infrastructure, things like that. And then getting back into GIS, if you know where all those assets are, if you know where things are supposed to be, you can try and figure things out to basically rebuild from that.
We did a very primitive GIS thing where we do telecommunication software, mass communication software, and I'm real curious if you went to school with this guy, because it's about the same time frame. He worked out a way to upload a map into our software, and you draw a random map. Or let's say make a square around the map, and we can call everybody's telephone in that square
Oh, sure.
and tell them. Now, would have come in real handy last week when that guy we're shooting people down on the south side, because there's people running all over this.
Right.
But it's proved to be, as I say, it was primitive, but it was very popular in our marketplace.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, there's all sorts of applications that you can do with it. I mean, people are coming up with ideas left and right all the time. I mean, this is just a small sample of what I went over, what's possible with it. And then again, I mean, I'm sure there's someone out there who's thinking of something clever right now.
We're working on refining it now, so a hospital could press a couple keys and see where the people who carry specific types of communication devices are in the hospital at that moment, which has obvious applications
Right.
in our market. It's pretty nifty stuff.
Yeah.
I just had a comment. I
Mhm.
read a book from the library about, it was written, I think, by the photographer who came along on this trip. Someone wanted to make a film about finding a lost city, and I can't remember, somewhere in Central or South America. And it was all overgrown. The stories, it was lore. The indigenous people kept saying, oh yes, there was this city. And so they actually used LiDAR to see
Yeah.
man-made objects. they actually did go there, but it was really hard because it was so overgrown.
Yeah, that was that a National Geographic that it just came out in?
And I think it was
Yeah.
National Geographic.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. I think it was Central America, and yeah, they used LiDAR. Basically, you pulled off the tree cover, and you could see the step pyramids that were built there. And yeah, it was a really cool article. I remember reading that.